Thank you very much, Han, and thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure for Bonnie and me visiting here these 2 months and doing these lectures to see how people come out on a Saturday afternoon. We would not see that in the United States, I think. Let me turn the lights down here a bit. The subject of the first lecture today is something that I've not written on much at all. I've taught it in sort of introductory fashion. So I hope, since this is an introductory lecture series, that it isn't too complicated, which is always the danger when you know too much about a subject. My style is to lecture until I get through the slides, but if you have particular questions, especially informational questions along the way, please raise your hand along the way. We'll also have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. I described this topic as one, with this first slide, saying the whole context here, ethically, is fraught with tension. First, there are huge benefits from research, and experimentation on human subjects is indispensable. Historical studies and non-human animal studies are simply not sufficient. A variety of scientific reasons for that that I won't go into here. Informed consent is generally considered, certainly since the Nuremberg trials about the so-called doctor experiments, which I'll get to in a minute, right after World War II, to be a very important part of the morality of experimentation. If medical treatment requires informed consent of the patient, all the more reason to require informed consent of the subject to research. Because exposure to risk and possible harm is usually greater in an experimental treatment than it is in a treatment that we already regard as best treatment for a condition. In some situations that might not be true, but generally it's true. Third, there's no competing right to the subject's right of refusal here and the right to be informed. The future beneficiaries of the research don't have a right to the benefits of research. It may be very, very good that they get the benefits of research, but we don't normally approach what they have to add to this situation as their rights to the benefits of research. At this point, we rarely, usually when experimentation is done, we rarely even know who they are, for one thing. Finally, sometimes, not always, the experimental treatment is administered by the patient's physician, particularly likely to be the case in therapeutic research about efficacy, rather than earlier stages of research. The loyalty and presumed oath of the physician is to the well-being of his or her individual patient. And insofar as that might not be by taking the experimental treatment, it can't be counterbalanced in terms of the physician's ethical loyalties by saying, oh, there are great benefits to this experimentation down the road. Because normally, that's not the way we look at the moral code of the physician. The Nuremberg Code is one of the two signature documents in this. The other is the Belmont Report later in the 70s. But just briefly on the Nuremberg Code, there were horrific so-called Nazi doctor experiments. People were infected with typhus vaccine and did get typhus in a situation where we thought they probably would get typhus until things were refined about the vaccine. Bone transplants were given to people who had no need for them whatsoever. People were infected with gangrene to study it to the point of wanting to make sure that the leg got all cut off and then studied whether it went further back up in the body, et cetera, et cetera. Two of the resulting codes that came out of the trials and discussions at the end of the war, two of the resulting codes provisions are these: that voluntary consent, meaning informed consent of, because it wouldn't be really voluntary if it weren't informed, is essential to do experimentation on any human subject. And secondly, that experimentation is prohibited if there's reason to think that death or disabling injury will occur. Now, this is actually phrased very ambiguously in the code, because one wants to know what the risk of death or disabling injury from the experimentation might be. But at any rate, the last one has an exception that I didn't note here, which is that unless the experimenters themselves were submitting to the experiment. If they were willing to take whatever risk of disability and injury and death there was, then it's okay to ask the subject to take that. But they have to be subjects too, if there's going to be risk of this order. Some experiments in the United States were also horrific. It's very important not to see this as some of these ethically scandalous trials and experimentation as done only in Nazi Germany, not by any means. And I'll describe one in some detail, the so-called Tuskegee syphilis study. Underneath the Nuremberg Code, I think, arguably, it's not the only possible moral foundation of the code, but the one that sort of leaps out of the pages of the code is a Kantian one, for those of you who are familiar with Kantian ethics. Its most famous phrase is probably that we are never to treat persons merely as means, but must always treat them as ends in themselves. Now, you can treat a person as a means, and in experimentation, you're always treating the subjects of experimentation as a means to the knowledge you're going to get out of it. But you can't treat them merely as a means. And that's one of the fundamental reasons why we require that they consent with adequate information to being a subject. Now, you can say, okay, it's very firmly in our moral framework here that the subject of experimentation needs to consent to the research. That doesn't settle a lot of questions around the edges. There are a huge number of questions around the edges. For one, how much information and of what sort needs to be given to the patient? For one thing, and we'll look at a case of this, is it proper to withhold information that the subjects will irrationally misinterpret? Is consent required even if no harm is risked? Is the mere fact of experimentation being conducted something that requires consent? If subjects receive less than the standard of care, but they would not have received, say, any care at all if it had not been for the experiment being conducted, have they been harmed? And do we need to get their consent? Or is it okay to give them less than the standard of care from the culture or perspective of the researching community? We'll look at that in the case of some international trials. And it'll also be a live issue an important issue in the Tuskegee study. Do randomized clinical trials, which I'll note now as RCTs, violate physician loyalty to patients? Because the patient is random. The patients, the subjects in a randomized clinical trial are randomized into different arms, one of which is the experimental treatment, another of which might be, if we use that arm, the existing best therapy, and a third arm of which is a placebo. Commonly, it will be a placebo and the new therapy. But The placebo is like a sugar pill if we're doing a drug trial, or some other substitute procedure that looks like the procedure that we're doing the experiment for. Can a physician, if the physician is one of the people administering this, really do this when the alternative, the placebo, doesn't seem to be the best treatment for the patient? How do you run a randomized clinical trial? Finally, are placebo arm trials themselves at all, even if they're not part of randomized clinical trials, ethical? New drug trials are commonly used, not always, but commonly use placebos in one of their arms. First case, and it involves the withholding of misleading information. The Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, New York, in 1963, a hospital for patients of chronic disease, serious chronic disease. They're labeled in the literature. This is just taken from the basic description of this case as debilitated patients. The purpose of the research was to measure the rate of the rejection of foreign cancer cells by persons with non-cancer illnesses. Previous studies had shown that people with cancer take longer than healthy people to expel foreign cancer cells that are injected, that they didn't develop in their own body. But the previous studies weren't sufficient to allow the researchers to get a better handle on how cancer cells are reacted to by the body. At any rate, in this experiment, many of the residents of the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital were injected with cancer cells. This was not therapeutic research. It was non-therapeutic research, which was not for their benefit. This is not like we had a new therapy that they might benefit from. They are not going to be benefited by the injection of these cancer cells. But on the basis of the previous studies, the researchers were very confident that there was nothing infectious, so to speak, about these cancer cells being injected. That is, the subjects wouldn't get cancer because of the injection of foreign cancer cells. The question was to learn more about how the body reacts to cancer. How fast would they reject these, repel these cells? To ensure sufficient enrollment, the researchers avoided saying, we're injecting you with cancer cells. They just said, we're injecting you with a certain substance. No matter how misleading, this information, the researchers said, would be reacted to by the subjects. Oh no, I don't want cancer in my body. But of course that would be misinterpreting the role of foreign cancer cells, the threat to cancer cells to them. But certainly no matter how misleading the information was, it was, as the lawyers say, material information to the patient. That is, would make a difference to the patient's decision about whether to agree to the research or not. It's precisely because it was material information, it would have changed people's minds about whether they were going to participate in the research, that the researchers didn't want to tell them this information, that it was cancer cells. Now, when this got revealed, various bodies in the state of New York immediately condemned it, sort of held it at arm's length, and it was a scandal. It's interesting, in retrospect, to look at just the substantive question here. If they were going to react, two big ifs, if they were going to, that one is actually quite secure, they were going to react irrationally by thinking of the injected foreign cancer cells as being a threat to them, which it was not. And secondly, if, in fact, this was a harmless injection of cells, which there was every reason to think, then was this wrong? Yes? They had very good reason for thinking it was harmless. Fine.
Except, if you look at the surrounding literature, when they interviewed the guy who was doing it and asked him, would you be willing to have the cancer cells injected into you? He said, no, but researchers are more important. I mean, these are very debilitated patients. So they may have had very good reason for thinking it wouldn't hurt them, but he wasn't willing to have it injected into him.
And that's why, maybe not with the appropriate surrounding language, that exception that I did not put on the slide about the Nuremberg Code. Experiment is prohibited if there's reason to think death or disabling injury will occur. And then the code actually reads, unless the researchers are part of the experiment. And, testimony like this is just really damning. And one of the reasons why it was regarded as a scandal when it got revealed. But what if it was another case where the researchers were willing to participate and where there was even more secure evidence than these researchers had that the injection of these cells was not harmful and not risky to the patient? A very different kind of case. This case is not about the quality of the information, although there was inadequate information given to the parents in this case. It's the so-called Willowbrook hepatitis studies conducted over a 15-year period of time. Gamma globulin injections were thought to generate immunity to hepatitis at the time when the experiment is being done. But there were lots of things about hepatitis that were not understood at the time. Different types of hepatitis weren't clearly separated like they are now in our knowledge. Gamma globulin works on this in this situation, but not on this variant of hepatitis, or people with this degree of the disease, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of reasons why this research might yield something productive. In a separate ward of the Willowbrook State Hospital for Developmentally Disabled Children, children were injected with gamma globulin and exposed to a milder hepatitis strain than was normal at the institution. The children were arguably better off for being put in the study and in this separate ward than they would have been if they were just in the institution generally. And they were all going to be in the institution generally anyhow. Parents, however, were not told of the hepatitis exposure. The study did lead to arguably significant advances. And even decades later, the two main researchers, the Rothmans, defended the study ethically as well as scientifically. The children were not made worse off. Let's assume that that's factually correct. Exposing them to hepatitis in a situation where they wouldn't be exposed to hepatitis at all does make them worse off, unquestionably. But they would have been exposed very likely to a worse strain of hepatitis. Furthermore, they got the benefit of especially good watchful care because they were in this separate ward. If their parents had been told that they would be exposed to this, but that it would not really harm them, if they really took the time to explain to the parents that this would not harm their children, they might have consented to the experimentation. But one thing that might well have happened, which is what makes this experimentation suspicious ethically, is that the parents would have said, oh gosh, you mean almost every kid in this institution gets hepatitis even more serious than the mild form you're going to expose them to? I'm pulling my kid out of the school. So there are tremendous conflicts of interest here. And the researchers who have to get the collaboration of the school not to tell the parents. it was widely condemned afterward, even though significant scientific advances came from this. Here's another one of the three, sort of big three in the history of US scandals, or arguably they were scandals. And this one certainly is a scandal. The study in Nature gone awry, we might call it. It was a study of black men begun in 1932 who had advanced untreated syphilis. It was done by the US Public Health Service to discern the natural course of the disease. A lot was not known about how bad the course of the disease was, how long people could live with it, a whole range of things that were not well known. Now, some people alleged later that the Scandinavian studies, I believe it was it a Norwegian study that was the comparison? Swedish study, that in fact, there was nothing that would come out of this Tuskegee study that was not already known in the Swedish study. It's true. That was the difference. These were different subjects. And some people thought there might be a difference by race of the person with syphilis in the natural course of the disease. The subjects, who were black male residents of this area of Alabama, around the town of Tuskegee, were told that they would receive treatment for bad blood, because that was the name that this disease had in the culture of their locale. That they would receive treatment with medications that were the only treatments at the time. As a matter of fact, those treatments are not regarded as very effective. And were it not for the study, in fact, it's very unlikely that they would have had any treatment at all in this poor black population of semi-rural Alabama, or much of it, very rural Alabama. They did receive low-dose treatments of arguable, but probably not effective. Aspirin, iron ointments, which I now realize not to be effective for this, but they felt good. And burial stipends, small burial stipends. And these were plenty sufficient to get the adequate numbers of persons in the study. Then, what happens is the really terrible part. It might be questionable even before this, but then this now really turns it into the scandal. By the way, along the way, spinal taps were done, autopsies on some. They did not receive the marginally better treatments that became known by 1940. It turns out that they were only very marginally better. They're still not very good. So they didn't lose much by not receiving those. When truly effective treatment came along, developed in World War II, penicillin, well known by the end of World War II for this disease, the United States Public Health Service took active steps to try to ensure that all the people in the study so far did not receive the new effective treatment. Because otherwise they couldn't follow the subjects out to their deaths and see what the natural progression of the disease was. The research continued until 1972, when it was exposed by a researcher who was not part of the study. Legislative hearings in Congress, US Congress were held, et cetera. Would this kind of research ever have been done on whites in the US? I think the historical record is, if you put all the pieces together, that it would not have been done. And certainly, even if it had been done as it was done to blacks, done on whites up to the stage that it was in 1945, on a white population, they would not have been prevented from getting syphilis treatment. The legacy of this scandalous experiment, unquestionably scandalous from 1945 to 1972. 1972, all the way through the civil rights movement of the 60s, this research continued. The legacy is still to this very day, distrust among African Americans of medical professionals, especially at bigger hospitals and research institutions. One of the results takes a toll on life-saving every single year. Because of this distrust, there's a significantly lower rate of agreement to donate organs, life-saving organs for transplant upon one's death in the African American community of the United States. For good reason. Good reason in a sense, even if there's also a good reason to think that this experimentation would not be done on Black Americans to this day, at this day. So the results, even if some good results could have come from this research, the distrust generated by this research has cost unquestionably thousands of lives. Now, a different topic, randomized clinical trials. They are very important in effectiveness trials after basic safety studies are completed. Active controlled trials, one version of an RCT, involve at least two arms, sometimes a third. The new therapy, the so-called experimental treatment, the existing best therapy, or one of several existing best therapies if we don't know which of the existing best therapies is absolutely the best, and perhaps a placebo arm. Those are called active control trials because they have in one of their arms, that is one group of patients in them, gets the best existing therapy. A second kind of randomized clinical trial is a placebo-controlled trial. Here, there is no existing best therapy arm, just the new therapy and a placebo. Further comment about the science of RCTs, the gold standard is a double-blind trial. Neither the researchers nor the subjects know which arm of the trial the patient is in, that is, whether the patient is getting a placebo or the new therapy in the case of the placebo-controlled trial, or they don't know which of three they're getting in the active control trial. And furthermore, follow-up caregivers, if it's really, truly, totally double-blind, it's really triple-blind because the follow-up caregivers don't know either because they can telegraph things. Okay? Now, because of the placebo effect in human beings, that is, the belief that you're getting treatment itself makes you better. Well, it's not just the belief, it's the belief operates in our bodies and nervous systems in such a way that you get better. That's the so-called placebo effect. The common placebo in drug trials is a sugar pill, masked with the right amount of bitterness, say, to taste just like the experimental drug. There are ways of adjusting what's in the sugar pill to make it indistinguishable in taste from the other pill. And actually, since no single patient is getting both anyhow, it doesn't have to be all that close. No, it isn't always drugs. There's a famous experiment involving surgery that was a double-blind study. But the most common use is probably with drugs. Now, the ethical question is, how can a person who's supposed to be loyal to the interests of the patient give a placebo or give experimental therapy instead of just straight out giving them existing best therapy? May a provider acting in the best interest of the patient participate in a randomized clinical trial? There was great anguish about this in the bioethics community until a famous article written by Benjamin Friedman back in, 89 or so, where he used the term, maybe it had been used before, but he made it famous, called equipoise. In equipoise, The provider reasonably believes that the patient is served no worse or no better by being in one arm of the trial than by any of the other arms. This could be because there might be some evidence of powerful placebo effects in a placebo-controlled trial, and the patient might benefit from that if they're in that arm of the trial. It could be because the benefit that we know the existing best therapy to have is quite low, or that the prospects for the new experimental therapy are, we have every reason to believe, given the science underlying the new therapy, to be likely better than the existing therapy. But we don't know yet. There are a variety of circumstances. One really has to look at the details of the situation and the particular new therapy before one would reasonably say, as a physician or a participating researcher, I'm in equipoise now vis-a-vis benefit to the patient, and therefore I can, in good conscience, advise my patient, certainly invite my patient, maybe even advise my patient to participate in this trial. Okay, you got the picture there of what equipoise is and how it solves a lot of ethical problems about the morality of these trials? It's very important that the description of the randomization is not deceptive, nothing glossed over in the mind of the researcher or in what is said to the patient, to portray it as equipoise when it's not. And further, that the provider have no conflict of interest. Because if the provider has a conflict of interest, why are we to trust their judgment that they're in that the situation is one of equipoise, given how difficult perception of equipoise can be? If the provider is paid by the drug company, right there is a conflict of interest, some say. A big one. A different question, but I hope you see that with equipoise, a randomized clinical trial can be ethically permissible in the right situation. But it's tricky. Now, another question, a different question, is when should a trial be stopped? I'll use the example of ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. It's a procedure by which the blood is run through a machine and oxygenates the blood in ways roughly as good as the lungs oxygenate blood. Significant advance over a ventilator. And a ventilator just gets your lungs to pump when they otherwise wouldn't have expanded and contracted. But especially in certain children, the lungs can't be coerced, enticed by a ventilator to do that. In that kind of situation, very undeveloped lungs, for example, this treatment, ECMO, is a huge advance. When it came on, when it came into medicine as a prospective treatment, the initial trials had to face this question. The results of the trials were so positive early on. You've got 300, 200, 50, whatever number of patients in a trial. After the first 30, you see significantly better results from ECMO than these children were predicted to have with the other existing therapies. Now, you're still uncertain, and there's a lot of refinement, because you would like to continue the research to try to sort out which children benefit more than with existing therapy, how much, what the timing and intensity of the ECMO treatment is. I mean, there are lots of things that continuing the research could continue to inform us of. So the researchers very much want to continue the research. And it probably is good for future children who might need ECMO that the research be continued. I don't think there's any doubt about that in this situation. But we already know that ECMO is now the best existing therapy after just the first 30 subjects. How much certainty are we justified in trying to achieve if current subjects in the non-ECMO arm would likely be better, very likely in this case, be better served if the trial were stopped and everybody was given ECMO? That's a real struggle between the research, an ideal, scientifically ideal piece of research that would get us the furthest on the one hand, and our loyalty to existing individual patients. Frankly, I don't think we've come up with a very good guideline as to when we are to stop a trial. You can see how difficult this question is, I hope. Now, international trials. Here the question is, what is the appropriate, or one of the questions is, what is the appropriate standard of care? The context, it's difficult to recruit subjects. If we take, for example, AIDS and the trials for AZT, a treatment for AIDS, for HIV. In the United States, AZT was already being used so widely in the US that you could not recruit people into a trial in which they would be randomized into one arm placebo, another arm the AZT. Lower dose. We wanted to refine the dose. We knew it was effective, so we weren't going to do placebo comparison, but we wanted to do dosage comparisons.
Less expensive.
Because that would be of great benefit to people if it turns out that a very low dose, much cheaper, is just almost as effective or as effective. Wow, that's a big, very beneficial advance. Now, it's very hard to get subjects in the United States and developed countries of the world for this research, but very easy in a poor country because none of them were getting AZT. The standard of care in the rich country is to get AZT, determined by judgment about its effectiveness. The lower standard of care in the poor country, people don't get AZT, is not determined by medical judgments. It's determined by the lack of resources. But it's an existing fact that the standard of care is lower. Placebos would be justified in terms of relative harm or benefit to the patient if no AZT is the standard of care, but not justified if AZT is the standard of care. But which standard of care is the proper reference point for the researcher? The researchers are working for firms that are connected in some significant way with developing treatments for developed world citizens. Let's suppose also that we cannot discern precise effectiveness and proper dosage levels without placebo-controlled trials. Here's a case where placebo-controlled arguably were very important to the advance of the information. This is a very hard question. The general opinion, I think now, after wrestling with this a while, is that if researchers from a wealthy country are getting subjects in a poor country, that they ought to use something close to the standard of care of the wealthy country. But maybe that means you can't do the trial. I mean, it's a very difficult problem. But here's one of the other issues that has come up about exploitation. Does it make a difference in wrestling with that difficult question of whether we should proceed with placebo-controlled trials in the poorer country if benefits of the trial are primarily for the rich country citizens but not for the poor countries? It would seem to. Could we change the situation to one in which the benefits would be greatly for the poor country citizens as well? We'd still have an ethical dilemma because the particular individuals on which the experiments were done might not benefit because some of them are in the placebo arm. Does fairness require financial compensation of the poor country by the rich one so that the poor country's citizens can benefit too? I think pretty unquestionably, yes. And the question then is, what's effective compensation? Would it be robust support for a better healthcare system in that country, as well as money with which AZT could be purchased for use there? That discussion gets to a lot of further pragmatic details. Now, finally, trials for new drug approval. This is a very lively issue in the United States and Europe right now because of a number of books in the last 10 years that have castigated the big pharmaceutical companies for having used their economic and political leverage to, this is the accusation of the critics, by the critics, to shape, warp, distort from what we should be doing the standards by which trials are allowed. The question I want to address in this larger picture about trials for new drugs is, when may placebo-controlled trials be used for a new drug for the same condition that's intended for the same condition for which there's an existing reasonably effective treatment? Now, if there's no effective treatment at all, if this is the first drug that could treat this condition, it's a different situation. In that kind of situation, I think unquestionably a placebo-controlled trial is permissible. But when there is an existing therapy, when may a placebo-controlled trial still be used? The U.S. Federal Drug Administration, and in most cases, the European Medicines Agency, which is their equivalent for the European countries of the FDA in the U.S., allows placebo-controlled trials when and only when there are compelling scientific reasons for still having a placebo-controlled trial. I'll expand on that in a bit. When delay or withholding of existing treatment would be pose no more than a minor increase above minimal risk to the subjects of the experiments, particularly the ones who were in the placebo arm. And the subjects are informed that the design of the trial they're possibly consenting to is this randomized controlled trial using a placebo control, and there's an existing therapy. Okay? Now go back to the first one. There's a great deal of controversy about this one. There's a concept called assay sensitivity in drug research. Assay means the actual chemical, and we want to discern the sensitivity of the body to the actual chemical that the drug is. This is why we run placebo-controlled trials, because we want to know what the relative effects are of the patient perceiving that they're getting treatment, which can have good effects, on the one hand, the placebo effect, and the physical effect of the drug in the body. There's a scientist, a very well-known scientist at the FDA, who has been a champion of still using placebo-controlled trials in situations where there's existing therapy, because he says, unless we do the trial on the new drug in the same way we did the trial on the existing drug, which was a placebo-controlled trial, because you can't do the trial on the first drug that comes on the scene without a good placebo-controlled trial. We don't know, from the results of the trials that were done on the existing therapy, really how effective they are. Those trials are not often big enough. They didn't run long enough. They ran long enough and they were big enough to lead us to think that this new drug back then was effective, but we don't really know how effective it is. And we've got hundreds of cases in the history of pharmaceutical medicine, of drugs that have were thought to be effective at first and were not, or not very. Obviously, in this first dot there, compelling the assay sensitivity argument for placebo control, is an admission that the FDA approves a lot of drugs on very slim evidence of effectiveness, because otherwise he couldn't make this argument. Some critics have thought that though his argument is a good argument, it just shows that the whole edifice of effective drugs, the way we approve them, the extent to which they're marketed, and a lot of other things in a situation that lead us to be suspicious, show that we're really skating on thin ice in a whole lot of our use, massive use of drug treatments. Now note, pharmaceutical companies badly want to use placebo-controlled trials rather than active controlled trials because so often the drugs they develop are, quote, me too drugs. That is, drugs for the same condition that there's an existing drug for, but the new drug by a different company would get the feet of that company in the market for a drug like a statin or other drugs that are used by hundreds of millions of people. All you have to do is capture 5% of that market with a new, equally good drug, a Me Too drug. You haven't advantaged any person in the whole, on the face of the earth with the new drug, but you've gotten your company $10 billion of profits over the next 3 years. Or more. Okay? Now, critics get very exercised about this in various respects. But here we come to another matter, partly spinning out of the last point on the previous slide. We have to ask a question about the informed consent. Is information given to the participants in these trials accurate when the purpose of the trial, which they're always supposed to be informed of, in sufficient detail for them to understand what they're really participating in here and why they might undergo some slight risk to benefit science and future patients? That's very important in the willingness of people to participate in these trials. The purpose is said to be for the benefit of future patients. But if the fundamental purpose is to develop a Me Too drug, that's simply false. In fact, it's a lie in certain situations. Now the critics get really exercised. Now, defenders of drug companies using placebo-controlled trials will say, we never know what's just going to be a Me Too drug. And first of all, Me Too is much too crude a description. There are many alternative existing best therapies which turn out to be slightly better for one drug among, say, 5. Initial good drug, 4 Me Too drugs are developed. Some of those Me Too drugs turn out to be better for an individual patient than the other drugs. So Me Too drugs are never strictly Me Too drugs. But the question here, and the important, and studies are done of what the relative prevalence of effect is here among these Me Too drugs. Well, there may be, say, 20 patients in the whole United States that can benefit from a Me Too drug who couldn't have benefited as much from one of the other 4, 5 drugs available, 4 of which were developed as Me Too drugs. But meanwhile, all this money has been put into developing these drugs that could have been put into developing really new drugs for conditions that we don't have sufficient therapies for. Now, the critics argue that it's not only the Me Too aspiration that should be queried hard here, but other practices of the drug companies in the trials and the subsequent information that's submitted to the FDA or the European Medicines Agency. Trial results are kept secret. They may. Every drug company can keep these secret. The ones that are turned into the FDA for approval have to be revealed, but not the other stuff that's kept back. And there might have been negative results that came out that were hidden. The trial may be stopped early. Oh, we get some good results quickly. If we get in the first 200 on a 500-person trial, we'll just stop it, not do the remaining 300. Well, what might have been discovered if we'd cleaned it? There are cases where the trial is rerun with a bigger group later, or the original size group when the first trial was cut off early, and they show that in fact there isn't any effectiveness. Is patient benefit really the goal, furthermore, if the outcomes measured by the trial are only so-called surrogate outcomes? For example, tumor shrinkage or lower blood cholesterol. Not real benefit to patient outcomes like longer life or lower number of cardiac incidents. The current new wave of anti-cholesterol drugs are called PCSK9 inhibitors. That's a particular protein inhibitor. They unquestionably, from even the evidence we have so far, lower cholesterol in drug-resistant, existing statin-resistant patients. We do know that. But what we don't know is whether that lowering of cholesterol, and especially the use of these new PCSK9 inhibitors on patients who do benefit already from statins to lower cholesterol, but they would have their cholesterol lowered much more yet by one of these new drugs. How much does that translate into longer life and lower cardiac incidents? We don't know if we stop the trials with resting content with lower blood cholesterol, or if the FDA approves them, and once they get approved, are you really going to get people into the trials that will show that maybe they aren't effective in actual longevity extension? This is why some people say we should not yet give approval for these on the basis of the surrogate outcome of lower blood cholesterol. We need to continue the studies until we know whether they got so-called real benefit outcomes to the patient. But meanwhile, of course, if we did insist on not approving the drugs until we continued this research for real outcome results, maybe it turns out that we've deprived people of a lot of very good medicines in the meantime. So this is a real struggle. Summary. Experimentation unquestionably poses a conflict between treating an individual subject not merely as a means, that is, treating them with respect and dignity on the one hand, and large potential benefits to others. A firm right to informed consent still leaves decisions at the edges, morally difficult decisions at the edges about how much and what information, alternative reference points for standard of care that determine whether there is actual risk or harm to the subject, when to stop a trial with good early results, what is true equipoise in a randomized clinical trial, and when, if there is existing therapy, may placebos be used to test a new therapy. So there's a lot on our plate yet in this discussion. And then if you mix it in with all the wider political discussion of the power of pharmaceutical companies, we still have a lot, but it isn't just limited to drug research. Questions, comments?
Well, thank you for your very interesting lecture. One question I have is, how do we distinguish using someone as a means and using someone as a means? Thanks.
We're certainly using in all cases of experimentation, we are using people as means. But the moral prohibition is always phrased as don't use people merely as means. If the prohibition were don't use people as means, there's oodles of things we couldn't do. People do things for their self-interest or the benefit of others to get people to do them. The question is whether those people, for one thing, agree to do them or not. Certainly agreement is one element in treating a person not merely as a means, that is their agreement. It's not maybe the only one. In this field of controversy, experimentation, you have people saying that I think one thing that everybody agrees on, the informed consent of the subject to research is mandatory. Actually, not even that is perhaps true. We got cases where there's absolutely no harm to the subject. It's observational research, and maybe it isn't required there, but glossing over that. In all the usual cases, the consent, the informed consent of the subject is required, or if we don't get that consent, don't even try to get it, we will have treated them merely as, they're like research vessels. What else do we need? Well, some people argue that there are levels of risk and harm that we shouldn't even ask people to participate in, if the research involves those levels, even if they were to consent. We'd be treating them merely as a means, even if we got their consent. I pass on that one. But it is the boundary lines of what constitutes treating a person merely as a means. Once we get past the requirement for consent are, I think, fuzzy and ripe with difficulty.
Lady first?
Bon?
Lady first.
I'm not sure which was.
Sorry.
Can you say a bit more about equipoise? Is it like an ideal? Because I think that if someone invented some kind of drug and then he's conducting experiments to verify whether like the drug is effective, then presumably the person would have at least some reason to favor using his newly invented drug, right? But then how can that equipoise be
Wouldn't be. The drug,
possible, right? If then it would be just like asking you to like eat this pin and see if it works, right? So I wonder what would be the some of the demands that are made of. Is it only about their belief, or is there anything that's more specific that's required of the, say, the provider, of the drug?
well, it has to be a reasonable belief. I think
Really believe that it's going to be no worse. It's not just an individual.
sorry, the next thing. The reference here is not just to, well, first of all, if we back up to what's actually done in situations like this, we have an institutional review board. It can be the hospital, it can be the National Institutes of Health, it can be universities, a variety of organizations in Europe and the US at least are required to have institutional review board approval of research before the research is done. And that group will often, if it doesn't already include medical researchers of other sorts who can query the application for approval of this research, sometimes they go out and get other opinions. But the test is whether, in fact, given our knowledge, this is not the specific opinion not just of the researcher, given our knowledge in medicine, does this new drug potentially have as much benefit for this condition, treating this condition, as the existing one? Now, we can't say, well, How much chance does it have of having as much or greater benefit? Because we just don't know. The researcher has been on a trail of reasoning and evidence discovery that leads her to think this drug is going to be better. But that's not the standard that has to be met in equipoise. Bonnie, who's taught this and talked to particular researchers in
So
situations.
let's go back to what Paul said about the article by Benjamin Friedman. The question was, you're the physician, can you ethically put your patient, you're supposed to be acting in the best interest of your patient, in a clinical trial where the patient might get the new drug or placebo? And so the idea is, well, if you're acting in the best interest of your patient, why would you put your patient in a trial where he has a 50% chance of getting a sugar pill? And Friedman said, because we don't know that the new drug is going to be any better than the placebo. In fact, it might be harmful. So what justifies the physician putting a patient, either recommending the patient go into it or suggesting the patient go into it, what justifies that is precisely what Paul said. We don't yet know until we do the trial whether it will benefit. If we do know, if we have a lot of evidence that this new drug is better than a sugar pill, then you're not in equipoise and you have no business putting your patient in a clinical trial. But if we don't know, that's what justifies putting your patient, recommending that your patient go into the clinical trial. Is that a little clearer now? Yeah.
Ultimately, in practice, I'm not sure that it certainly doesn't clarify everything because it doesn't settle how much knowledge we need to make certain claims. There's always some uncertainty here, and a physician could claim that it's reasonable for her to believe that this new drug is no worse than the existing one because we don't know certain things. But how do you weigh up the pros and cons of these different unknowns? By definition, they're unknowns. And what your question about what's reasonable belief here, that you're in equipoise as a physician administering this drug, or administering either a placebo or the drug, and you don't know which, it's a difficult question. It's not just the individual physician. You have to, the individual physician, if it's to have a reasonable belief, has to be relying on a lot of other views here. I mean, I'm just sorry, I just omitted that because I assume that in a profession like medicine, it isn't just an individual physician's belief that would be sufficient.
Well, I'm from medicine, so I could talk a little about the clinical hypothesis. The critiques about, well, I got 2 points about the clinical hypothesis is that one point in terms of the therapeutic misconception. Basically, we are doing trial not for the benefit of the patient, for the produce knowledge. So when we have informed consent clinical trial, we're clearly saying that it's not for your treatment, right? So then people will not have any kind of misconception that they will participate in trial for the benefit for themselves. So that's part of saying that how could you kind of make some good argument to clinical hypothesis because you're trying for the knowledge, not for the treatment for the patient. So one part is about the critique from the therapeutic consumption that sometimes the clinical hypothesis doesn't really make sense because we are doing trial for the knowledge, not for the individual patient. But the other case about the clinical hypothesis coming from the global health movement, this is I actually am teaching this one in my class. I take this example for there was a big trial. They're actually looking at the effects of the hand washing among kids in the developing country. And they're trying to see whether hand washing is good or not. Then their whole critique from the Berkeley and Harvard saying, this is so stupid. We know the hand wash is good. Why do you need a trial? That actually comes about the hypothesis saying that, since you know it's good, you don't need to try to, give the water, give the, sewage. That's better for you. So that's what's the purpose of trial that comes out of it. So I guess there's some kind of interest that whether we talk about the individual or population level trial. But the comment on the HIV the trial, the AGT trial, from the HIV researchers, actually, yes, we're saying this one is one of the most successful case in the history of the HIV intervention. Because I use this one asking whether it's good or not, but the idea about this case is that basically we call the 80 versus $800. So in the United States, the HIV care for the $800. But basically the Global Fund, they don't have the money to treat for the African people, the people in Africa. But they could do some $80. So basically they tried that whether even give them $80 good enough. But then people say, no, you shouldn't, right? Because, why? Because the people in the state, they get $800, but then why the people in Africa, they should get 80 instead of $800? So there was a trial. But there are a lot of kind of resistance about this case, but they did it. And then they actually found out even with the $80 of single dose of the treatment will give a really effective significant reductions of HIV transmission from the mother to baby. So they're saying that, yeah, see, sometimes we need it. So, even though we don't really give a best interest, but we could provide locally best benefit to patients. So in the end, we're all happy. But if that trial fails, we'll be really trouble. They say that you see what's going on. But I have one case. Paul, what do you think about this one? Because this actually I'm participating. This is actually what's going on really in China. Clinical trial case. Even I also have some comments from Bonnie. We're doing interesting trial in China, mainland China. What we are doing here now is that this was funded by NIH. In China, there's a small city. They're building up the new house, the apartment. So then people apply for lottery to get the subsidized housing. So we somehow get access from the small city that we could control the old lottery. So then we are actually randomized people. But the people who apply for lottery, they don't know. They are on the trial. So then we are randomize them. Then we pick the people, then we're actually gonna follow them whether living in the new condition make a better life being or well-being in the community, in the people. So
It's a different kind of randomization.
yeah, but the idea is here is that the people who apply for the housing, they have no idea whether they are in the research. Because we don't tell them, we're just saying that, because they're saying that, instead of the government doing lottery, why don't we do the randomization? So we could pick them, and then we can follow, right? So in that case, do you think we should, is that ethical to do? I was thinking, I don't know, there's something going on. Maybe they shouldn't be known that they're on the trial, right? They're being followed up. But we cannot tell them once we're saying to them that you are being followed up for 5 years, then, we can't really see what's the kind of cause of all the good environment. So somehow the NIH, but yeah.
If we take the AZT trial, the low dose, the trial to see whether the low dose works, which had huge benefits because it's so much cheaper if it did work, the argument for the ethical permissibility of that trial, and it was a spectacularly successful trial with huge benefits for people. If we hadn't done it because we had ethical scruples that were not well-founded, it would be a tragedy. But the case for it. Can I finish
The
my?
critics of the AZT trials did not criticize having one arm the expensive treatment that we knew worked and was being in the US versus the low dose. The question was whether you could justify a placebo arm.
Yeah, no.
Now, why do you need a placebo arm? Some people said you don't. We know the $800 regimen works, so now we're going to see if the $80 regimen works almost as well, let's say. By the way, even $80 for most African countries was beyond what they could afford. Their whole healthcare budget wasn't that much. So why do you need the placebo arm? Because the scientists said you need to know whether the $80 is better than nothing if you have a limited healthcare budget and it works a little bit. You might say, no, we need to know how it compares to placebo to know if it's worth the dollars. So you can't just say, yeah, why wouldn't they do it? The question was the placebo
No
arm.
matter, that unquestionably is part of the whole mix here, but the case for doing either one of these trials and the way to rebuff the charge that the researchers shouldn't be allowed to do this because the standard of care is the $800 dose. No, wait a minute, the real standard of care in the subject population that they're doing the research on is no AZT at all.
Yeah, actually, there was a three arm. It's the possible $80.
Right, but the question is, if no subject of the research has been harmed because they would have gotten no benefit at all if the research weren't being conducted and the research hadn't come to them as a subject population, then some people will argue we don't even need to get their consent. Because they're not being harmed.
But it's
Well,
also
that leads to another complicated discussion.
But it's also why does it cost so much?
Yeah, there was the main argument basically saying
Why does it cost so much? Because the drug companies are charging that much. So you could say, instead of saying, oh, but they won't get any treatment, you could say, oh, they could be provided with
okay,
affordable
but-
treatment if the drug
No,
companies
but
bring the price
let me
down.
defend the drug companies a little bit here. There's a larger picture that's very important in the background of this discussion, which if there is a drug company representative in any of these discussions, she will jump up immediately to make this point. You can argue that the amount of research that was put into a given drug, amount of money to develop that drug, the R&D money, research and development money, has paid off 100 times over by the profits from this drug already, the AZT that's being sold for $800 a dose in the developing countries, say. So why do they need to charge anything for other than the cost of the actual physical material and packaging and getting it out anymore at all? But that's not accounting for the costs of all the drug research and development that never pans out. And so you got to make a lot more than just the R&D on your individual drug. And of course, the part of the problem here is we don't even have good transparent records of the drug companies about what all that is. And so this continues to just boil as a controversy. Could I?
The vaccination of the Ebola the case here is that we know that there is a virus of the Ebola, but we don't develop the vaccine. But we're saying that the pharma company is saying that it's not worth it. So they don't make any profit making out the vaccine, because they're saying that, in terms of the scope of the Ebola, it's not really big enough to make a profit as compared to the HIV. So that's the one reason. But then it comes about all this case that, see, this is what the pharma company problem, not about the efficacy. You're saying that you don't want to develop, you don't want to spend money. They're saying common case of the AG trials, that it's not about the money, it's about your pharma company. They don't have any commitment to give the drug. So same goes here about so people saying that, are you going to have the vaccine for Ebola? Probably not, because pharma, they're not interested, because there's no any profit. Why U.S. has some, when they have a case of the Ebola, the patient, they come to the United States, they get a treatment, because there was only one single pharma company, actually, they did some trial for the Ebola, not because of the outbreak, because of the Bush administration, the time of the 2011 World Trade Center, they set up the funding for the anti-bioterrorism. So they actually give some funding to companies, and they're trying to make some treatment to kind of for the anti-bio. So that's the one company who have it. So somehow even the pharma company, they're only interested about somehow the terrorism or any for the for profit.
In response to your first comment about 5 minutes ago or so, let me, well, not that one, the one before that, where I thought you made the point that the motive of the researcher is not for the benefit of this particular patient or subject. The motive is to develop the knowledge by which we can get good treatments for down the road. Unquestionably, the motive of the researcher is not for this patient, even when you've got so-called therapeutic research where what you're giving is possibly effective for that patient. The motive of the researcher is not to benefit this patient. It's laudable, or excuse me, it's not necessary that the researcher have the motive of benefiting this patient. But back to the equipoise discussion, if there are healthcare providers involved in the research process at all, isn't it crucial that their motive be to serve the patient, their patient that happens to be in the trial or agrees to be in the trial? And so we get the equipoise requirement in that context of therapeutic research. Research that's so therapeutic, perhaps, that it needs to involve providers for its administration. You can't do any good placebo-controlled trial without having providers give the experimental medication. Because otherwise there's no placebo effect, because if a researcher walks in to give it to you, you're not gonna have the same placebo effect as if it's given to you by your nurse or your doctor. So that's where the equipoise comes in. I don't think anybody pushing hard on that believes that the researcher's motivations and reasonable beliefs have to be that this is in the, as good as much for the benefit of the patient as any of the other options. Now, that raises a further question. I think it's why this discussion is so interesting and does not just yield results by some easy formula. There's risk in some of this research for the individual subject. And what's wrong with that if we have a good informed consent requirement where people are adequately informed? And unlike the Willowbrook case, it's not hidden from the parents that this was the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital wasn't hidden from the parents that this was an injection of cancer cells. If they're adequately informed, why shouldn't research subjects be allowed to participate in research that does pose some risks for them? I care about other people. So some people fear that we're getting so insistent about the equipoise requirement that we're actually preventing subjects who would be willing to, who actually want to participate in research and are willing to take some risk. Now, I don't know exactly how to cut that, and believe me, you get on I can imagine if you're on an institutional review board and you get one of these cases where there is risk to the subject, the patient, they'll treat it with tendency to not approve it, but there are just a lot of differences here. Let me comment on I think I got the context about the last one in China, where the individuals do not give the consent.
So they don't know.
Right, they don't even know the research is being done.
Yes, but they're following up.
Right.
They're following.
One of the biggest critics of the current FDA set of regulations and the pharmaceutical companies and the way they use that to get approval, and also a critic of two scrupulous bioethicists on this matter, is Ben Goldacre, who wrote a book called Bad Pharma. And he says, this is what we should do, but the drug companies don't want to do it. And other people on IRBs, the so-called ethicists, think it wouldn't be permissible to do it, but this is what we should do. You have two statins. Take a large population. It can be in the British National Health Service, it could be, regions, locales. You get a large population where the providers, the physicians, are allowed to prescribe for their patient who has high cholesterol and want it to have it lowered. 3 different statins, very common ones. We have no idea whatsoever whether one is more effective than the other. They're all regarded as super low risk, proven because they've been used for 20 years, and effective. But it could be that some of them are effective for certain categories of patients that the other ones aren't as effective for. But we've got to do research on that. Now, the drug companies don't have any motivation to do that research because they're making big bucks on all the statins. And they don't want to risk getting cut out of the market because their statin turns out to be not as effective if we run these trials. So the proposal by Ben Goldacre, arch critic of the drug companies and the FDA, but also critic of 2 fastidious bioethicists, is that we ought to be able to enroll thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people in a particular population into 3 treatment arms, statin 1, statin 2, statin 3, by a click of the computer that the provider, since the provider has to register any drug given to a patient in the computer record anyhow, and once does that, a randomization process pops up and they're assigned to one of the 3 equally effective statins. And then we just keep track. We run the trial for 20 years. We get real outcomes, actual deaths and cardiac events, not just lower cholesterol. And we really know something. But we don't get the consent of the patients to be part of the research. They never even know there's research. They haven't been harmed at all. Does that violate informed consent of research subjects? Yes, in effect. Yeah. This is a big new issue, somewhat new, I think. That's right. I asked one person, Ruth Macklin in Bioethics, who's worked so much more on the ethics of research than I remotely have, this, and she said, oh, there should be a simple way to get consent of the subjects, even if it's 500,000 subjects over a 10-year period to be part of this research. You just tell them they're part of the research. Do you object? Kind of an opting out procedure. They'll not opt out. They'll look at their doctor and say, should I be part of this? And the doc says, in equipoise, perfectly permissibly can say it was loyalty to her patient. Yeah, sure, it's fine. Is Ruth Macklin right that you still have to get explicit consent? Or is Ben Goldacre right that we should be running massive trials in these situations, not in others, without people's consent?
I wanted to ask you about voluntariness.
2 last questions before we need to get the break here.
So some people have criticized the Nuremberg Code for limiting research to voluntariness, saying that if we can't do research, for example, on Alzheimer's patients because they're not capable of giving informed consent, we'll never discover which drugs actually work on Alzheimer's patients. Could you say something a little more about that?
Well, how do we make
think?
any other decisions about Alzheimer's patients? We, first of all, go to proxies. In the US, at least, I think, would go to proxy decision makers. Who speaks for the Alzheimer's patient? Any incompetent patient. If they consent to the research on the incompetent patient because they believe that it's not contrary to the best interest of the patient, or believe that or believe that the patient would have consented to it had they been competent, then fine. The informed consent requirement has been met, even if it's not actual contemporaneously competent consent.
So is your answer that we can't interpret voluntariness in Nuremberg as meaning strictly speaking voluntary, but rather we have to interpret it in terms of what the legal guardian says?
Right. Now, suppose...
Or do you think we should give up that part of the Nuremberg Code?
Well, I wouldn't give it up, but to take one of the actual Nazi experiments was on severely developmentally diminished children. Low mental capacity. They didn't have those children wouldn't have the capacity to consent to any research. But we wouldn't eliminate them now in this century from being subjects of research as long as the people who are properly the ones to speak for them said, yes, you can have these people in the research. But of course, the Nazi experiments didn't even begin to try to get to that. I mean, it's laughable to think that the Nazis would have actually gotten proper proxies for the handicapped children.
Doctors for the Alzheimer's patients whose parents usually aren't around, and the doctors are the ones trying to do the research. But that just
Well, that raises another conflict of interest. Doesn't that raise another conflict of interest?
But usually it's about the assumed consent, basically saying that if the patient were mentally capable, he or she wouldn't be in consent. Therefore, we're doing is that. I mean, is that how different between sort of 100% voluntariness and then they take as an assumed consent, not an informed consent?
Thank you for the vigorous discussion here. we need to take a break for coffee. And if anybody has remaining questions, I'll be around up here or at coffee break and we can chat.
Thank you.
And we'll-
So,
We start again at 4 o'clock promptly.